Hello everyone, Hafsa here. Last lesson, we've seen multiple ways to creating storyboards and basically starting our project and planning it and deciding on which shots and which timing we're going to use. And in the last section, we've learned all the techniques that help us to achieve the animations that we're trying to do, both the technical parts and the more cinematic parts with the perspective and camera. And in this lesson, we're going to learn how to combine these two and basically transform our storyboard into rough animation. When it comes to animation, there are two main approaches on how to animate, as we've discussed in multiple lessons. These are the straight ahead and pose to pose approaches. The straight ahead lets you be free and get interesting results in your animation, while pose to pose lets you be efficient and keep consistency. Most commercial animation studios, or really any projects made by multiple people, which uses storyboards, will work with the pose to pose approach, since by default having the main poses and timing already decided by the storyboard limits the freedom you can have with your movement. That being said, some elements in a character design, such as hair and clothing, work better with the straight ahead approach. And many nuances of the movement, as well as its pacing within the storyboard confinements, are up to the animator making the rough animation stage. There are multiple tricks and approaches that you can employ to make your animation smoother while being efficient, and we're going to learn them in this lesson. Being an independent animator, which is in charge of the entire artistic look and direction of the project, gives you a high degree of freedom in your project, as you are the person that determines the overall timing and poses within the storyboards, and you will probably be able to make changes to the storyboard and not stick to it as tightly as in a more commercial setting, in which teamwork and clarity are important for the process to work smoothly, because you depend on the works of other people. This gives you, as an independent animator, the opportunity to make large chunks of your animation with the straight ahead method, which gives it additional smoothness and makes the animation more interesting. And actually, I, on my own personal projects, usually go with an almost straight ahead approach, where I add most of my rough animation as animation in low frame rate, and then just add additional in-betweens as necessary. But in general, the amount of keyframes, as you can call it, is pretty high, because it's almost in a straight ahead approach. But of course, when I have actual clients where I have a storyboard and limitations with the entire length of the video and the timing of each individual movement, then I go with the more traditional pose-to-pose approach. But even so, there are some things that you can do within the animation itself to make it more appealing and make the entire process easier. So, if you're here for independent animation and being a single creator, I generally just create the thumbnails of my storyboard in the actual format that we've seen last lesson, and then I animate my ideas straight ahead and basically just change around the timing of each individual shots to make it fit with the movement, instead of going the other way around and fitting the movements to the length of the animation. This approach will give you the most natural looking movement, but you also need to be able to estimate your abilities and the amount of effort that you want to dedicate to your project, and create something that balances your vision with the amount of work that it requires. Otherwise, you might not be able to actually finish your project and get frustrated and just abandon it. Now this, same as when making projects for a client, might limit the actual time and amount of frames that you can dedicate for each individual shot. So you would need to limit yourself to the confinement of the timing in the actual storyboard. So in these cases, you will actually need to plan your movement in advance to fit the length of the shot, and not the other way around. Ideally, you want that within the time of your shot, the movement in the animation will be clear to the viewer and that you will be able to complete it. So you might need to change it, tweak it, or simplify it to make sure that you get both of these conditions while planning your animation in each shot. And if you're working with an animatic or with a studio, the length of some shots might not even be decided by timing, but by the amount of frames, so you really have to plan each individual frame. So, the first step to actually planning your animation in advance and transforming your storyboard to animation is importing your storyboard into your animation software. So as we've done in the last lesson, we basically created either a still storyboard or an animatic in Procreate. There is no real way to transform the still storyboard, so we first have to make the still storyboard into animatic, and then we're going to import it into FlipaClip as a video file. To do this, we simply save the Procreate file as an MP4, and then again save the MP4 to our actual files application. We do this because importing it as a file instead of as a video from our photo album will make it so it's in better quality. Then we go to FlipaClip and open the toolbar at the top right corner, and then choose the import video option and the file option within that, and just import our video. FlipaClip translates the video to the frame rate of your project, so in instances where each frame is planned, or in cases where you're working with professional clients, make sure to match your frame rate to the frame rate of your actual final production to get the exact timing of your storyboard. Again, the industry standard is currently 24 frames per second. But in cases where you know the timing doesn't have to be frame perfect, or when you're making your own personal project which doesn't have to be on 24 frames per second, you can just import it to Procreate in any frame rate which is convenient for you. I personally import in 8 frames per second when making my own personal projects, because my main frame rate is 8 and then I later duplicate certain frames to adjust the timing to the 24 frames per second standard frame rate. Once you've imported your storyboard into FlipaClip and you know your exact timing for each individual shot and each keyframe, now you can start planning your actual rough animation. Again, there are 2 approaches to actually creating your animation, even if your overall timing is dictated by the keyframes in the storyboard. And we're going to choose them depending on the actual trajectory of the movement itself. If you have a very clear trajectory, where you can basically just plan your entire movement in one go, even if your movement is complicated, then it is better to use keyframes, because you will make sure that your spacing is consistent, your character is consistent, and that each ease in and ease out works well together. But if you have a shot which has a lot of camera movement, the character basically stays in place for the entire scene and just each individual part is seen from multiple angles, or if your character movement is going back and forth and repeating and it's getting really complicated to understand which direction is which, it might be better to actually go with the straight ahead method. And again, certain object and character design details are better to do in straight ahead as well, because they do depend on the main action of your animation. So, starting with the pose-to-pose method, first you just go into your storyboard and plan your trajectory. Put a marker on each keyframe in your storyboard and have your trajectory completely mapped out between each frame on each scene, so you can see it and have a clear view for where you're going to put your ease in and ease out. This will also help you understand the overall number of frames that you have for each individual shot, so you know if you have enough frames to complete each part of your movement. The next step is to actually draw your keyframes. The entire pose-to-pose method works by how important they are to the overall movement. And then just filling in the blanks between each individual keyframe or breakdown pose. Basically, you have 3 or 4 main passes in your entire animation process, which are the keyframes, which dictates the overall movement and the correct timing, and they are the most important poses. Then you have the breakdowns, which are just in the middle of the action or closer to the edges, where you have your indication of ease in and ease out, as well as any major direction changes in your movement, which are not affecting the timing. And then you have your in-betweens, which are just additional frames which help you smooth the ease in and ease out between each part of your trajectory, as well as raise up your frame rate if you want to increase it later on. Just remember that if you are increasing your frame rate, you still need to make sure that your timing is being kept, so you need to add your additional in-betweens with the concepts of ease in and ease out in mind. So basically, if we're going with the pose-to-pose method, we have 4 clear passes, with each one serving a slightly different purpose. First, we have the storyboard poses, which are the base poses and can also be classified as keyframes. These are the crucial poses needed to understand the perspective, positioning, and timing of your character in the shot. Next, we have the actual keyframes. These include the storyboard frames, but add the additional frames which help better define the pacing between each of the storyboard poses. These frames are most essential poses that help you understand the complete movement with the correct timing and nuance, with the smallest amount of frames. After that, we have the breakdown poses. These are poses that are important to determining the pacing of the overall animation and help you plan their location between each keyframe. You will often find them in the middle of a movement and close to the keyframes, as they are important to indicate the slow in and slow out in your trajectory. The final stage is the in-betweens, which are the lowest priorities connecting frames, so if you are using a low frame rate, you can just omit them. And they are there to support the movement and make it smoother, as well as help you raise the frame rate if needed. The higher your frame rate, the more in-betweens you will have. They will usually increase in a much higher rate than your keyframes and breakdown frames, because your frame rate is not going to change your actual timing. So there's no reason to add additional keyframes or breakdown frames which just support the timing and nuance. The spacing between your frames also needs to follow a clear and complete arc. You have to make sure that your frames are not accidentally being bunched together in a way that obstructs your movement. As you can see, here I first had the timing dictated by the storyboard frames, and then planned the actual movement of the character between each major change in the storyboard. And since my animation is at a pretty low frame rate, and the movements themselves are pretty low energy and are quite straightforward between each pose, I did not need to consider the breakdown and the in-between the same way I would in higher frame rate production. That being said, this technique is also applicable as a base when later increasing the frame rate. Basically what I talked about before, where I basically create a lot of keyframes in low frame rate animation in the straight ahead method. You can almost say that by choosing to use a low frame rate, you're actively choosing to only use your keyframes and breakdown frames. And to increase the frame rate, you'll just need to add additional in-between in the appropriate number that will allow you to achieve a smooth movement with increased frame rate while still keeping the timing. As you can see, in my initial trajectory plan, I do not include the overlapping movements and details in the breakdowns and keyframing. I will only be adding them later on multiple separate layers while using the straight ahead method in order to preserve the natural look of the drag effect, which can be easier to understand once you have your full movement of your character with the correct momentum. And once you have all of your frames and your animation is basically all done, then can change your actual frame rate by increasing your frames per second to 24 and then duplicating each individual frame the appropriate amount depending on the nuance in timing that you want. So if you will duplicate it 3 times to have 8 frames per second. And if you have fast movement, you might want to duplicate it once to make it 12 frames per second, or you might want to leave it at once for 24 frames per second. It all depends on the effect that you want to have with your timing. This technique can really help you with your independent animation because it allows you to save energy by lowering the amount of actual frames that you have to draw and making the overall workload lower. This might not be possible to do if you're working with clients because they might need consistent frame rate or they will specifically choose a frame rate for individual shots or parts of your movement. If your character movement does not have a very clear trajectory, then it's better to use the straight ahead method. By this, I don't mean completely going off the rails and basically changing your entire scene, both shot length and character movement, because you've used the straight ahead method. What I mean by using the straight ahead method is that between each individual keyframe on the storyboard, you're going to fill them in using the straight ahead method. The first step to do this is basically analyze the environment your character is in, because your character perspective will depend on that environment. This is especially important if you have moving camera or 3D spaces. The next stage is to actually mark your keyframes. You want to be sure that your movement is following your actual storyboard and that you're not going to just randomly go off the rails and just completely ditch the original movement and idea, especially because you already have the perspective set in. Once you do have your keyframes and the overall perspective of each individual frame, then you just go back and forth and fill in the blank frames between each individual keyframe. To do this, I usually reference both the background and the perspective, as well as the onion skin. Now, the onion skin feature has the possibility to show less or more frames by changing the settings. So, to be efficient, when I have a large gap in the number of frames between each individual keyframe, what I do is that I just go to the middle between the keyframes and then increase the onion skin feature, the appropriate amount of frames, so I can see which poses I need to connect, and connect it naturally like I would in a regular straight ahead. Now, the reason I call this straight ahead instead of pose to pose, even though we are filling in blanks between individual keyframes, is because we don't actually know which pose is going to be correct. We have uneven spacing in the amount of frames in each gap, and we're basically just making guesswork to the placement of your character within the trajectory. I have a loose guideline where if I know that the spacing is uneven and that I increased the onion skin more in one side, I will try and shift and draw the character's position closer to that side of the trajectory, especially if I know that I'm going to use is in and is out. But if it doesn't work out well, I will just delete and redraw it, or I'll adjust it to fit the overall trajectory of the movement. And basically, I will just go back and forth between each frame and fill it in as necessary. Really, this method is just basically a combination between straight ahead and pose to pose, and works best where you have a lot of keyframes, like I do when I actually create my animatics. This is important because we still want to keep our timing like it was in the storyboard and the consistency of our character model. In general, I wouldn't recommend going completely straight ahead and never adjusting your trajectory or your timing, because it can get very frustrating, and it's also really hard to adjust your trajectories with slow in and slow out if you don't know your overall timing and range of movement. Now that we've reached the rough animation stage in the production, we've actually arrived at the first big barrier and the motivator when it comes to independent animation production. Up until now, we've put a lot of effort into many different things in the animation production. Even though each one of them was very time-consuming, it was a still pretty thoughtful work, and you had a lot of variation in the process itself. Even if a certain character design or background took you a long time to complete, at least you were working on different parts of it with different techniques and different brushes and different colors. Even if your animation took you a long time to figure out, you are still thinking constantly and trying new things and variations within the process itself. But now that we've reached the rough animation stage, this is where the work starts to become automatic. You've already figured out the base of your movement using the pose-to-pose or straight-ahead methods. You've already had your understanding of your animation and your camera movement. You already know how your scene is going to be designed and you figured out the perspective, and you have your character designs and your backgrounds already made. You don't need to think about anything anymore. You just need to mechanically add the frames in between. This is the in-betweener's job, and this is the most technical aspect in actual animation. This is where you just look at the joints of your character, the positioning, in your timing, and just add them completely mechanically and completely automatically, because there's basically only one correct answer between two individual poses, if they are close to each other. And if you're having a slightly bigger movement, which lets you have more wiggle room, it's still not enough to create completely new poses or think of completely new ideas, because you still need to work within the limitations of your keyframes. The reason I find this part to be the biggest barrier when it comes to animation is because even though this step is extremely simple, it's very, very time consuming. You can see here with this example that even though this part of the video is edited and run in high speed, this section is still way longer than any other sections that we had before. And the type of work that I'm making is very, very repetitive, especially in frames that look very similar to each other. I'd want to give you some advice on how to keep yourself motivated, because the rough animation stage is only one of 3 barriers that you're going to have as an independent animator. The reason this one is special is because you have to have it in order to have animation at all. With the cleanup and coloring, you're just not going to have a complete product, but without the rough animation stage, you're not going to have an animation at all. Unless you're working as part of a studio where you have dedicated in-betweeners, you're going to have to complete this stage in order to create any type of smooth movement. And of course, if you're an independent animator, the other 2 stages of cleanup and coloring are even more mechanical and even more time consuming. But I find that once you get over the initial barrier of the rough animation stage, it's much easier to get into the mind frame that allows you to create the other time-consuming stages of independent production. So here are my tips on how I keep myself motivated while creating these very long and time-consuming steps. Of course, these are only my methods and they might not work for you. So you really need to sit with yourself and see which things can give you motivation to complete your project. Once you start making this exercise by yourself, this last section in the course is basically just a whole bunch of manual labor. So it's important that you figure out your motivation now, or you might not be able to actually complete it. So, the first thing that keeps up my motivation when I'm working is that I give myself very clear goals when it comes to my personal works and my professional works. On my personal project, I decide straight from the beginning the length of the video that I'm going to work on, and I calculate the number of frames that I have to draw. And I give myself a limit of the amount of frames that I'm going to dedicate to each project. For me, the limit is around 120 frames for personal projects per week, because I know that I'm going to work on professional projects as well. With these types of limitation, I know how to divide my work per the amount of time that I'm willing to give my project. I know, for example, that I need to make around 10 frames per hour. And so I give myself a quota, which I need to complete, and it's very easy to keep track of. Of course, you will need to adjust your frames and quotas according to your own ability. So think about one of our first lessons where I talked about adjusting the workload to your physical and mental condition in order to not burn yourself out. Even within the quota, you can give yourself smaller goals, which helps you divide the work even further and help you keep track on it, so it doesn't feel quite as endless and repetitive. For example, if you are dividing your character details into separate layers, you can decide on only completing one detail within your dedicated number of frames. So for example, in this case, you could decide to only animate the hair or the clothing or the eyes for a single day quota. Using this method is actually very useful to get your quality up as well, because you can give yourself time to focus on the smaller details of your animation. You can make sure that you have the right effect and animation exactly like you want them, which also keeps your mind a little bit more engaged and makes the entire process a little bit less stifling. Another thing that you can focus on is trying and keep your line quality consistent. Right now, we are still not making our final lines, so you don't have to make sure that the line itself is at final quality, but you do want to make your sketches as readable as possible. Even if the line itself is not completely stable and doesn't connect at exactly the right spot, you still want to find the one perfect line which completely captures the volume and model of your character design. And of course, the final thing you can focus on when it comes to making your rough animation at a higher quality is actually paying attention to the variations between the location of the poses in your ease in and ease out sections of your rough animation. Like we've seen with the timing example way back at the first animation lesson, you can create a completely new nuance in your motion by small changes to the position of your object within the trajectory. In your rough animation stage is where you're going to have your final timing and nuance in the motion. So focusing on getting it exactly right is a good way to make the entire process more thoughtful and enjoyable. If any of these fail and don't entice you enough to complete the entire process, you can also use outside methods to keep up your motivation. Because this type of work is so repetitive, you can take this time to complete any other tasks or interests that you have that only require audio. A lot of the time, when I'm animating, I'm not listening to music, because my music selection is not big enough to the amount of animation that I'm making. Instead, having something like podcasts or audiobook is very helpful to keep up your concentration and keeping the work interesting, because you can really focus on what you're hearing since the process is very automatic. Using this time for other listening activities, such as lectures, phone calls, or language lessons, is also very nice in my experience. When making this part of the animation process, you can actually communicate and meet up with other people, and I find it to be a pretty pleasant part of the work when combining all of the outside things that you can make during it. There aren't many other jobs where you get to do manual activities which allow you to continue listening and seeing other media while working. Honestly, the main limitation with making this part of the process is that you have to continuously use your hands. Other than that, you can basically do whatever you want. But even after hearing all of this, you might be struggling with this stage if you're just a beginner, or even if you're an experienced animator who just dislikes doing it. I want you to know that these manual stages of the animation are still the parts that I really don't like about my animation process. No matter how you're trying to sugarcoat it, this is a very time-consuming and repetitive process. So if you're still struggling with this part of the process, know that it's completely okay and natural. Same as with every other thing that we've covered up until now, it takes work, time, and practice to build up your patience for you to be able to sit for long stretches of time just doing this part of the process. But same as with any other thing that we've done up until now, the fact that you have to work so much to complete this part of the animation makes it that you're going to improve in it so much quicker than any other part. The more animation you're making, the quicker you're going to get at making them. You can probably already guess by my output that I managed to shrink down this process quite considerably. And it reaches up to a point where I can make a completely new frame in less than a minute. So the overall process doesn't really take that much time at all. It's just the process to getting there that takes a lot of time, patience, and determination. So really, the best advice I can give you about keeping up your motivation is the same as my advice on starting a new project. You need to think about the actual skills you're acquiring and the practice itself, and not the product that you're trying to create. And you need to keep in mind your own capabilities and physical condition in order to not burn yourself out. Once you've completed all the rough stages, including finalizing your overall movement and adding the overlapping elements with the correct pacing, using both in-between and frame multiplication to create nuance with your timing, you need to make sure that your characters are actually easy to understand with the correct volumes, proportions, and details in the character design. Especially if you have multiple layers in different colors that are hard to understand and differentiate, and overall create a pretty messy drawing that will make it so that your cleanup artist would not know where to place the clean line. In order to complete your rough animation stage, you need to add an additional layer which goes over the different layers and combines them in a way that allows you to have clear vision of your character. In this stage, your lines do not have to be pretty and can still retain some imperfections for the cleanup artist to fix later. Of course, the less imperfection, the easier jobs they will have, and if you are an independent animator, you would want to make this stage easier for yourself as well. What's really important is to make sure that you keep your character model consistent and make it so that it's kept with the correct proportion, size, and volume at all time. The cleanup artist's job is to make the lines clean. They need to have a good base to work effectively. They don't actually have the time to clean your volumes and correct your details. If you are an independent animator, you might put less effort in this stage because you already know how to fix these volume imperfections in the cleanup stage. Because as both the animator and the character designers, you already know where you have incorrect details. In my personal projects, I sometimes leave the animation line art in this rough stage because it is clear enough for my viewers to see, while taking much less time and effort to create the final product. I also quite like the aesthetics and the extra energy that these squiggly lines bring to the animation. But even if the lines are squiggly, you need to make sure that you only use one line and that you're not making too much of a mess of your sketch. Because if you're adding too many lines and affecting the thickness of your sketch, it's still going to be very difficult for your cleanup artist to place the line in the correct way. If you are an independent animator, you can kind of get away with simplifying some details in your character, because you know that you're going to add them later on in the cleanup stage. This is what I usually do when I add hair or certain eye details, because I know they are going to be added in the cleanup or in the actual coloring stage. Still, it's worth keeping them at least in a rough version if you know that you're going to add them later on, just so you can make sure that you keep your model consistent and that you don't have any flickering on these details. The exercise for this lesson is pretty straightforward. Basically, just create rough animations from the storyboards that we've made in the last lesson. Try and create the rough animation using the two different approaches, so you can test both of them. Again, make sure that your line quality is correct and that you're keeping the proportions and volumes of your characters, as well as the correct perspective with the environment. To recap, today we've learned how to import your storyboard to Flipperclip and how to animate within its timing limitation in two different methods. We especially expanded upon the pose-to-pose animation method and seen several tricks that can be done with the layers and duplication features of Flipperclip to make the animation process more efficient. Next lesson, we'll learn how to effectively polish your animation and make preparations for your coloring and compositing stage. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye!